There's a very specific kind of chill you get when a story looks you dead in the face and goes, "This kid is going to be a problem for everybody," and then it actually follows through. That's the feeling I had watching Anak Terbuang Kebangkitan Dewa Perang, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it grabbed me by the collar early and just wouldn't let go. And yes, we are talking Sparta, gods with ego issues, a sealed child with power that's way too loud to be allowed, and that delicious tension of a hero who's been forced to live small until the world gives him permission to explode. You're watching Jonota News, and if you like drama reviews that aren't afraid to say, "This worked," and "This absolutely didn't," hit subscribe. No pressure, just come hang out when you are bored and need something to watch. And before we get into it, I'm doing moderate spoilers. I'm going to talk about the big setup turns and some key moments that the show itself puts front and center, but I'm not going to spill whatever late-game reveals or final stretch outcomes they're clearly saving as the emotional landmines. So if you are brand new, you are safe to keep listening, just know I'm not tiptoeing around the premise. Because honestly, the premise is half the appeal. The opening idea is already kind of heartbreaking in a mythic way. Kale is 6 years old, already carrying too much, and his mother Lyra, who the show paints with this mix of tenderness and terror, marks him with a seal to keep him protected from the jealousy of the gods. That's such a sharp, cruel little hook if you think about it. Imagine being a mother in a world where divine attention isn't a blessing, it's a threat. Where being noticed by the wrong immortal isn't destiny, it's a death sentence. The show doesn't romanticize it. Lyra's choice feels like a compromise that costs her something. It's protection, yes, but it's also a muzzle. Then we jump 12 years, and the story makes the bold decision to not let Kale land in some secret warrior training montage fantasy. No, hidden prince, being quietly revered by a loyal few. Now, he's in Sparta's palace orbit as the so-called Anak Haram, the discarded one, the stain people feel entitled to point at. And I need to say this upfront, the humiliation stuff can be hard to watch. Not because it's poorly done, because it's a little too believable in the way power structures enjoy cruelty. You can practically smell that polished stone corridor energy, the kind that echoes every insult so it feels like the building itself is agreeing with them. What makes it work is that the show doesn't just use the bullying as cheap fuel for a future glow-up. It sits in the discomfort. It lets the contempt be institutional, casual. People don't even think they're being villains, they think they're keeping order. And Kale's survival tactic is not to fight it, not to scream, not to demand respect. He shrinks. He learns how to be overlooked. Which, in a story where we know he's basically a hidden weapon, is tense. Because you are watching someone compress a storm into a teacup. Here's the question that kept pulling me forward in those early sections: how long can you force a person to live like they're harmless before the world finds out you lied? Because the shift when the threat finally arrives, when Syrian and the giant Uruk hit and the palace energy goes from petty cruelty to full panic, is the kind of tonal snap that either breaks a show or makes it. And for me, Anak Terbuang nails that snap. There's a moment where the air changes. You can feel it in how the editing tightens. The camera stops lingering on decorative arrogance and starts hunting for exits. The music gets less chord drama and more heartbeat. And suddenly all the people who were so confident when they were humiliating a boy are faced with the fact that their titles don't mean anything to a monster kicking down the gate. Aristos falls, again, I'm staying in the show's broad strokes here, but the impact of that loss is staged like a punch to the city's spine. You don't even need a long speech. The show uses absence as sound design. The moment someone like Aristos is gone, it's like the background noise of safety shuts off. And what I appreciated is that the series doesn't treat death like a plot coupon. It treats it like a vacuum. People don't instantly become heroic, they become lost. The city becomes desperate. The palace becomes a room full of people realizing the walls were never going to protect them. And this is where Kale stops hiding. If you've seen any promotional clips, you probably already know about the golden eyes. But watching it in context, it hits different. The way they time it, after we've watched him swallow insult after insult, after we've watched him choose invisibility as a way to stay alive, when that seal finally gives, it doesn't feel like power up. It feels like someone finally taking their first full breath in 12 years. Let me paint the scene the way it landed for me, because this is the moment the show basically tells you what kind of ride you signed up for. The space is chaos, shouting layered over clanging metal, dust in the air catching the light like dirty glitter. Celine is there, and the show frames her not as some helpless object, but as a person trapped by timing. She's trying, she's moving, she's not frozen. But the threat is too big, too fast. Uruk is this wall of violence, and Zirian is the humankind of menace, smarter, more precise, enjoying the fear a little too much. Kale steps in, and for half a second, he looks like he always has, the boy everyone trained themselves to dismiss. His shoulders are slightly rounded like he's expecting a hit. His hands aren't even clenched yet. And then the sound drops out in that classic pre-impact harsh, the kind where you suddenly hear fabric shift, someone's breath hitch, the little ring of a weapon settling. His eyes go gold. Not pretty gold. Not Instagram filter gold. It's predatory. It's ancient. It's like the light isn't reflecting, it's coming from behind his face. And the direction does this smart thing where they don't over-explain it with dialogue. They let other people's bodies react first. Someone takes a half step back without realizing. Someone's voice cracks mid-command. Even the framing changes, Kale stops being shot from above or from the side like background furniture. The camera meets him head-on. He becomes the center of the room's gravity. And then the violence is decisive. Not messy for spectacle, not dragged out for sadism. Kale saving Celine isn't some drawn-out, almost too late cliché. It's fast, like he's been holding back muscle memory. When Uruk goes down, you feel the weight of it. The show sells scale with sound, the thud is deep, like the building itself flinches. And Zirian's end, again, moderate spoilers, but this is literally part of the core arc they want you to know, lands like the series saying, stop underestimating him. We are done playing. Now, I'm going to give you a slightly contrarian take, because I can already hear the internet version of this conversation. People are going to obsess over the golden eyes and the kills and go, finally, the bullied kid gets revenge. And yes, that's satisfying on a very human level. But I don't think the best part of that sequence is the power. I think the best part is the restraint before it. The show takes a risk by making Kale's hiding feel like humiliation rather than noble patience. That's uncomfortable. But it makes the reveal feel earned, not inevitable. If Kale had been secretly smirking for 12 years like, just wait until I show you, the moment would have been empty. What makes it hit is that he wasn't waiting to impress them. He was surviving them. And I'm not going to lie, there was a split second where I got a little emotional in a way I wasn't expecting. Not because of the action, because of the relief on his face right after. It's subtle, it's almost nothing, but it reads like, I can stop pretending. If you've ever been in a room where you had to act smaller to keep the peace, that micro-expression lands like a bruise you forgot you had. But of course, the story doesn't let it stay personal. Because the second kill shows the world what he is, the world responds the way it always does to someone who breaks the rules of the hierarchy, with fear dressed up as righteousness. King Xerxes gets furious in that, how dare you disrupt my control, way, and brings forces to the border. And I love that the show doesn't frame this as a simple, evil king is mad. It's political. It's ego. It's the terror of a ruler realizing a new variable exists that he can't command. So when Kale ends up leading 300 Spartan soldiers toward Thermopylae, the story shifts from hidden power revealed into responsibility. And that's where a lot of shows fumble, by the way. The power fantasy is easy. The leadership fantasy is easy. But mixing them, showing that being the strongest person in the room doesn't mean you know how to carry other people's fear, that's where drama either becomes real or becomes cosplay. And I need you to hold on to that, because this is the point where Anak Terbuang could have turned into pure marching and speeches content, but instead it starts slipping in the quieter psychological questions under the armor. What does it mean for Kale to lead men who used to laugh at him? What does it do to your sense of self when the same institution that branded you, Haram, now wants to use you as a shield? And maybe the most interesting one, can you ever actually belong somewhere that only accepts you when you're useful? If you're still with me, here's what I think is the real tension engine of this drama. It's not just, will they win? It's, who does Kale become the moment he stops being a secret? Because the show is constantly playing with the idea that Kale's seal wasn't only about hiding him from gods, it also shaped his personality. You don't live 12 years inside a cage and come out clean. You come out with habits. You come out with flinches. You come out with a relationship to power that is complicated. And I appreciated that the writing doesn't make him instantly charismatic. He's not suddenly the loud, inspiring commander just because the plot needs him to be. There's an awkwardness to him in positions of authority that feels real, like he keeps checking himself, am I allowed to speak like this? That kind of character continuity is rare in these mythic hero setups. Visually, the series leans into a texture I'd describe as stone and sun and blood. Sparta feels heavy. The palace isn't glam, it's imposing. Lots of hard lines, big shadows, torchlight that makes faces look carved rather than soft. When they go outside, the sunlight isn't romantic. It's harsh, bleached, like the world is too bright to hide in. And that ties into Kale's arc nicely, because the more his power surfaces, the less he can live in the corners. One of the smart-ass choices they make with Kale's goldenite state is that they don't overuse it like a party trick. When it shows up, it changes the whole soundscape. The mix gets tighter, the bass gets heavier, sometimes the music even pulls back like it doesn't want to tell you how to feel. And I love that, because a lot of fantasy dramas will slap a huge choir on every power moment like they're desperate for you to clap. Yeah, the show is more confident. It lets silence do the flexing. Celine, too, let's talk about her for a second, because in a story like this, it's very easy for the saved character to become a symbol instead of a person. What I liked is that Celine doesn't read like an accessory. There's a steadiness to her presence. Even when she's in danger, she's not written like a screaming prop. She's paying attention. She's processing. And that matters, because Kale's relationship to other people, especially people who see him without the palace's contempt, is basically the emotional oxygen of the show. And this is where my one little self-aware aside has to come out, because I caught myself doing it. You know when you're watching a drama and you are like, okay, yes, the war is happening, but are these two going to have a moment where they finally talk like humans? That was me. I'm sitting there pretending I'm all about tactics and borders, and secretly I'm like, sir, please heal emotionally. I'm begging. What keeps it from becoming cheesy is the performances, especially the way Kale is played in the in-between beats. Not the fighting. The waiting. The listening. The moments where someone says something cruel and you see the old survival instinct rise up like a reflex, and then he swallows it because he's trying to be more than his wounds. There's a physicality to that. The jaw tightens. The eyes flick away for half a second. The posture changes like he's bracing for a memory, not a sword. And if you are new to this kind of mythic war drama, you might be wondering, is it all grim? Is it just suffering and speeches and blood? Surprisingly, no. There are pockets of warmth. Not sitcom jokes, not tonal whiplash, but those dry little human moments that happen in desperate times, someone cracking a comment that's more about staying sane than being funny. The show uses that sparingly, and it works because it feels like soldiers being soldiers, not writers trying to go viral. Let me pull you back into the bigger thematic thread, because I think this is why Anak Terbuang is landing for people. The title is doing double duty. Anak Terbuang isn't just Kale being treated like a discarded child. It's also about what happens when a society discards empathy. When a palace discards truth. When rulers discard anyone who complicates their narrative. And then, inevitably, the bill comes due. The giant Urug and Zirian aren't just enemies, they're consequences. They're what shows up when you've spent too long believing your own propaganda. And Lyra, hovering in the background of all of this, even when she's not physically present in the current timeline, adds this maternal tragedy that I think elevates the whole thing. Because the seal is not just plot magic. It's a mother's fear becoming a permanent mark on her child's identity. There's something brutally honest about that, and it hit me harder than I expected. I had this moment where I thought, Lyra didn't just hide Kale from jealous gods. She hid him from being loved openly. She traded community for safety. And whether or not she was right, the cost is written into every scene where Kale looks like he's asking permission to exist. Now here's the pivot that made me trust the show even more. Once Kale becomes a public force, the writing starts interrogating the idea of chosen one narratives. It doesn't fully deconstruct it. This is still a drama that enjoys its mythic grandeur, but it does poke at it. Because being powerful doesn't automatically make you righteous. Being feared doesn't automatically make you respected. And being needed doesn't automatically mean you are forgiven. That's why the border escalation with Xerxes matters. It's not just bigger battle incoming. It's the story asking, what happens when your existence threatens the political order? Kale isn't just a warrior now, he's a walking destabilizer. And the series shows the way institutions react to destabilizers. They try to control the narrative first. They label you. They redefine you. They call you monster, savior, heretic, weapon, anything except person. And this is where, as a viewer, I got genuinely tense. Because I know this genre. I know how easily it can slip into simple hero worship. But Anak Terbuang keeps slipping in these looks, these side glances from other characters, that remind you Kale is not safe just because he's strong. Strength doesn't protect you from politics. If anything, it makes you more targetable. The stronger he becomes, the more everyone else starts calculating. So let's talk about the Thermopylae setup, because the show uses that historical mythic reference with a very deliberate vibe. Kale leading 300 Spartan soldiers isn't framed like a tourist postcard. It's framed like a vow that might be suicidal. The landscape feels like it's swallowing them. The air feels thin. Even the way the camera holds on the line of soldiers, those helmets catching light, those shields creating a repetitive rhythm, there's a solemnity to it, like the show is saying, this isn't about glory. This is about what people do when there's nowhere else to go. And I want to give credit to the pacing here, because this is where a lot of series get impatient and sprint toward the biggest set pieces. Anak Terbuang lets the dread build. It lets you sit in the spaces between decisions. It gives you those scenes where men try to sleep but don't. Where someone sharpens a blade that's already sharp just because their hands need something to do. Where Kale is surrounded by soldiers and still somehow feels alone, because leadership is isolating when you don't trust your own place in the group. But I also have to be honest, there are moments where the dialogue gets a little too polished. Like you can hear the writer's pen going, yes, this is the line that will be quoted. Sometimes it works, sometimes it lands like myth. Other times, it pulls you out because it feels like nobody in that moment would actually talk like that, especially not soldiers who are terrified and tired. The good news is, the performances usually sell it anyway. You get enough grit in the delivery that the line feels lived rather than posted. Another thing I loved, and I didn't expect to love it, is how the show visualized Kale's power as something that isn't purely empowering. When his eyes go gold, it's cool, yes. But it's also a sign that the seal is breaking, that the protection is fading, that the gods might be looking again. There's an undertone of every time you use this, you're ringing a bell. And that's so much more interesting than power with no price. You can feel the series building that anxiety. Okay, Kale can kill a giant. He can drop a threat like Zirian. But what happens when the attention shifts upward? What happens when the jealous gods stop whispering and start acting? The show plants that fear without over-explaining it, and for me, that's exactly the right move. It respects the viewer. It lets dread be implied instead of narrated. And since we are talking craft, cinematography and editing, there's a clear visual language difference between Palace Shame and Battle Truth. The palace scenes love symmetrical framing. People are lined up. Status is communicated by who stands higher, who sits, who gets centered. It's rigid. Then the battle scenes break that. The camera gets handheld, a little more chaotic, sometimes even claustrophobic. And it's not just for adrenaline, it mirrors Kale's internal shift. In the palace, he's trapped in rules. In battle, the rules are gone, and weirdly, he's freer. Let me throw another little rehook at you, because this is the part that decides whether you'll be obsessed with this drama or just mildly entertained. Do you think Kale's biggest enemy is actually on the battlefield? Or is it the palace that taught him to hate himself? Because the series keeps returning to that psychological scar. Even when Kale is doing something undeniably heroic, you can still see the old label clinging to him. Anak Terbuang. The show understands that shame is sticky. It doesn't vanish because you win a fight. It just changes outfits. It becomes doubt. It becomes anger. It becomes that dangerous impulse to prove yourself until you break. And that's why the Kelsey-Lean dynamic matters so much. Not because we need romance to spice up war, though, I'm not going to complain if the show goes there with maturity, but because Celine represents being witnessed without contempt. The way she looks at Kale isn't use him or fear him. It's recognition. And recognition is the thing Kale has been starved of. If the series keeps honoring that, it's going to make the emotional stakes hit even harder as the conflicts expand. Now, if you're a newcomer, you might still be asking, is this just another special boy saves Sparta story? And I get that skepticism. I really do. The genre is crowded, and chosen one narratives can feel like reheated leftovers if they don't bring something personal. What makes Anak Terbuang feel fresher, at least to me, is the bitterness in it. The show isn't pretending Sparta is noble by default. Sparta is harsh. Sparta is hierarchical. Sparta is the kind of place that would absolutely abuse a child and then act shocked when the child grows into a weapon. And that's where my admiration comes in, because the drama doesn't ask you to cheer for the system. It asks you to watch Kale navigate the system while the system tries to claim him. That's more complex than it sounds. It's also more uncomfortable, because it forces you to admit something. Sometimes the people who benefit from your power are the same people who harmed you. Music-wise, the score is doing a lot of heavy lifting without being obnoxious about it. There's this recurring motif, low, pulsing, almost like a distant drum, that shows up around Kale's sealed identity. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's barely there, like a threat under the floorboards. Then when the action hits, the percussion doesn't just go faster, it goes heavier, like the music itself is carrying armor. And in the emotional scenes, they don't oversweeten it. They let strings sit in that uneasy space where you feel sadness and danger at the same time. Sound design deserves a shout too. The show knows the difference between loud and impactful. When Urag moves, the sound isn't just volume, it's weight. You feel it in the low end. When swords clash, there's a sharpness that doesn't feel like cartoon metal. And the best choice they keep making is letting certain moments breathe. Silence after a death. Silence before Kale reveals himself. Silence when someone realizes they've been wrong. Those silences are doing emotional work. Where the show occasionally stumbles, for me, is in how quickly some side characters shift their attitudes once Kale proves himself. I'm not saying they all instantly become fans. Thankfully, the show isn't that naive, but there are beats where you can feel the plot pushing a relationship into respect faster than the psychology would. If you've spent years degrading someone, you don't just flip a switch because they saved your life once. You rationalize. You resent. You feel threatened. You try to reassert control. The series does some of that, but I wanted even more ugliness there, honestly. Not because I enjoy misery, because it would make the eventual, earned respect feel even more satisfying. And speaking of earned, Kale's leadership of the 300 is the area I'm watching the closest, because that's where the show can either become iconic or just good. Leading 300 Spartan soldiers toward Thermopylae is already loaded with mythology, but mythology can be a trap. It can make writers lazy. The drama's job now is to keep it intimate. Make me feel like each soldier is a person, not a number. Make me feel like Kale isn't just carrying a legend, he's carrying names. And in the mid-stretch, you start to see glimpses of that approach. Little moments of camaraderie that aren't too cute. Moments where Kale has to make a call and you can see the weight of it settle into his shoulders. Moments where he looks at the men following him and realizes, if he messes up, they die. It's not just his life anymore. That's a different kind of terror than being bullied in a palace. It's a terror that comes with agency. There's also an interesting subtext happening with masculinity here, Spartan masculinity specifically. The palace culture teaches that tenderness is weakness and cruelty is strength. Kale's arc challenges that by making his restraint, his ability to endure without becoming a sadist, feel like the real power. When he kills, it's not performative. When he leads, it's not for applause. And that contrast quietly critiques the people who mocked him, because their version of strength was always theatrical. His is functional. I keep thinking about Lyra's seal, too, and how it functions thematically as generational trauma in fantasy clothing. A parent makes a choice to protect a child, but that protection becomes a wound. The child grows up with that wound and has to decide whether to carry it forward or break the cycle. The series hasn't fully unpacked that yet, again, I'm avoiding late reveals, but the groundwork is there. And that's the kind of thematic spine that can make a show linger in your head after the fight scenes blur together. Okay, let's get a little more specific about what I think the show is doing with Xerxes and the border pressure, because this is where the political drama starts to taste richer. Xerxes isn't just mad villain. He's a ruler whose authority depends on everyone agreeing that he is the biggest thing in the room. Kale's existence disrupts that agreement. And rulers like that don't just attack physically, they attack narratively. They try to define you before you define yourself. They try to make your strength sound like a threat to order, because order is the word powerful people use when they mean my control. So when Xerxes moves toward the border, it's not just a military action. It's a message. It's him saying, I see you, and I'm not going to allow you to become a symbol. Which is funny, because by trying to crush Kale publicly, he kind of makes him a symbol anyway. That's the irony the show is playing with, and I love when a drama understands irony without winking at the camera. If there's a flaw in the show's approach to this big mythic framing, it's that sometimes the scale threatens to swallow the intimacy. When you are dealing with gods, kings, giants, legendary last stands, there's a temptation to talk like you are carving history into stone tablets. And the series sometimes leans into that voice. When it works, it's goosebumps. When it doesn't, it feels like the characters are auditioning for a statue. But again, the reason I'm still in love with this drama's vibe overall is because of how it returns to Kale's interiority. The show keeps bringing you back to the boy who learned to hide. Even when he's standing tall, you can sense that hiding instinct like an echo. That's good character writing. That's the kind of detail that makes me trust the creators. And I want to talk about one more thing that surprised me, the way the show treats fate. In a lot of God-touched stories, fate is presented as this glamorous, inevitable runway the hero walks down. Here, fate feels more like a trap that keeps getting dressed up as destiny. Kale didn't ask for divine jealousy. He didn't ask for a seal. He didn't ask to be a palace punching bag. The story keeps implying that what makes him heroic isn't that he's chosen, it's that he keeps choosing anyway, even when every choice costs him. Now, if you've been waiting for me to be petty about something, because you know I will when it's warranted, here's a small gripe: there are a couple of moments where the show's action geography gets a little muddy. Not always, and not in the big signature beats, but in some of the in-between clashes, the cutting can get a bit too eager. You lose track of who is where for a second. It doesn't ruin the experience, but it's noticeable when everything else is so strong. And for a war drama with mythic stakes, clarity is part of the satisfaction. Let me see the choices. Let me see the danger. Don't just give me motion. But when the show locks in, when it slows down for impact, it's genuinely cinematic. The lighting choices alone in the Kale reveal sequence. That's the kind of thing you remember. The warm torchlight catching the dust, the gold in his eyes punching through the brown-grey palette, the way the camera holds just long enough for you to register everyone's fear. That's craft. That's somebody behind the camera understanding that awe is built, not announced. I'll leave you with another little thread to chew on as we keep moving through this story, because this is where I think Anak Terbuang is either going to break hearts or become legend. Once Kale steps into the role of Dewa Perang in people's minds, will he even be allowed to be Kale anymore? Because I've seen this kind of arc go wrong before. The world starts projecting. The hero starts performing the projection. The human disappears under the armor. And the tragedy becomes not that he dies, but that he lives as a tool. This drama is smart enough to know that's a possibility. You can feel it circling that question in the way it frames Kale when others are watching him, how often he's isolated in the composition even when he's surrounded. And that brings us back to Thermopylae, to that march toward a place that is already soaked in story. The 300 aren't just soldiers in this context, they're a myth waiting to happen. The show uses that weight like a pressure cooker. Every step forward feels like a door closing behind them. And Kale, still young, still carrying 12 years of being told he doesn't belong, has to lead them anyway, not because he wants glory, but because he's the only one who can. And right there, in that tension, between the boy who was sealed for safety and the warrior who's now unsealed in the public eye, you can feel the drama setting up its most dangerous emotional promise. Not, will he win, but, what will winning cost him, and, who will he have to become to make it out of this with any piece of himself intact? Because if Anak Terbuang keeps doing what it's been doing, balancing spectacle with bruised humanity, then the next confrontations aren't just going to be about borders and armies. They're going to be about loyalty, about betrayal, about the kind of fear that makes people do unforgivable things while insisting they're doing it for the greater good. And the show has already taught us something crucial. The moment Kale stops being invisible, everyone starts choosing a side, and some of those choices are going to get very ugly, very fast. So when the soldiers line up, when the shields come together, when the wind hits that narrow pass and you can almost hear the world holding its breath, I'm not just thinking about the battle choreography. I'm thinking about the palace. I'm thinking about Lyra's hands sealing a child. I'm thinking about Celine's eyes watching him like he's real. I'm thinking about Xerxes' fury turning into policy. I'm thinking about how a discarded child becomes a weapon and how every person who once spit the word haram is now going to look for a way to claim credit if he saves them. And the scary part is, the show is good enough that I don't fully trust it to be kind about any of that. In the best way. It feels like it's willing to hurt its characters for meaning, not for shock. It feels like it understands that heroism isn't just a pose, it's a slow, grinding decision you make while your past is clawing at your ankles. So yeah, if you're a newcomer and you've been on the fence, that's the texture of this drama, mythic action with a nasty little emotional undercurrent. And as Kale steps closer to Thermopylae, as the story widens into war and divine attention and political fear, the real question isn't whether his eyes will glow again. The real question is who's going to try to put the seal back on him, metaphorically or literally, the moment they realize what he represents. And there's a particular kind of scene the show has been teasing, the kind where power doesn't show up as a punch, but as a choice in a quiet room, where a leader decides what kind of man he's going to be while everyone around him waits to see if he's a savior or a monster. And you can feel that kind of moment approaching as the march tightens and the air gets heavier and the story starts closing its fist around the characters' throats. And Kale, still carrying that old instinct to disappear, has to stand there and not disappear, even when everything in him wants to step back into the shadows where it's safer, where nobody expects him to be anything at all, where nobody can be disappointed by what he becomes next, and that's where the march becomes the real story, at least for me. Because once you accept that Kale is strong, the suspense has to move somewhere else. It moves into faces. It moves into trust. It moves into the way a group of hardened soldiers recalibrate their entire worldview around the fact that the discarded child they've been trained to sneer at is now walking at the front of their formation like he has every right to be there. There's this quiet kind of cruelty the show captures on the road. Nobody says the slur out loud anymore, not when Kale has just proved he can end a giant, but you still feel it in the pause before they answer him. In the way certain men look at his back like they're trying to decide whether to fear him or resent him. And the actor playing Kale, again, I'm not going to pretend I know anything behind the scenes, but the performance choice is so smart here. He doesn't bask. He doesn't strut. He walks like someone who's trying not to trip over the role he's been forced into. And the show keeps giving you these tiny, human reminders that he's still basically a teenager. Not in a he's childish way, more like his face still has softness when it's not hardened by adrenaline. There are moments where he listens to older soldiers talk and you can see him absorbing it like he's building a vocabulary for leadership in real time. It's not, born commander. It's, I'm learning because people are going to die if I don't. Let me ask you something that sounds simple but isn't. If you were one of those 300, would you follow Kale because you believe in him, or because you are terrified of what happens if you don't? Because that's the tension simmering under the Spartan pride. Sparta loves strength, but it also loves control. Kale is strength that can't be neatly controlled. So every salute, every respectful nod, every, yes, sir, has this question hiding inside it. Is this loyalty, or is this submission? The Thermopylae destination isn't just a cool reference point either, it functions like a mood. The show treats that name like an omen. You hear it and you feel the narrowing of options. The landscapes start looking more severe. The cliffs feel taller. The sky feels bigger but less comforting, like it's there to witness rather than protect. I'm a sucker for environmental storytelling, and this drama uses terrain like it's part of the script. You are not just watching soldiers walk, you are watching them enter a place designed to swallow armies. And the sound on the march, this is where I noticed how intentionally the series mixes its audio. You get the rhythm of boots, armor shifting, the soft clack of spear shafts against shields. It's almost meditative until the score slips in under it like a low warning. Not a triumphant, we are going to battle, anthem. More like a pulse that says, you are walking toward a decision you can't take back. When Kale interacts with Celine in these stretches, again, staying moderate here, not inventing some big romantic twist the show hasn't promised, what I liked is the restraint. They don't turn every conversation into, do you believe in me, speeches. Sometimes it's just a look. Sometimes it's the way she stands slightly closer than everyone else, like she's not afraid of the heat coming off him when that power starts to stir. And Kale, for all his strength, often looks like he doesn't know what to do with kindness. That's one of the more painful truths the show slips in, cruelty is familiar. Kindness is the unfamiliar terrain. There's a particular kind of shot the series repeats, Kale in profile, the line of soldiers behind him slightly out of focus, the horizon cutting the frame like a blade. It's simple, but it keeps telling you the same thing, he's isolated by necessity. Even when he's surrounded, he's alone at the front. And I swear, that visual motif lands harder because we saw him earlier as a boy trying to disappear into palace corners. The geometry of his life has inverted. He used to hide at the edges, now he's forced into the center. And every time the story leans into that loneliness, I feel this little anxious excitement, because that's where the best character choices come from. When a person is isolated, they start making decisions with no emotional cushioning. They start taking shortcuts. They start believing the worst thing anyone ever said about them. The drama knows this, and you can feel it setting the board. Here's the other thing, the show is not shy about making Sparta look morally complicated. They're the protagonists in the immediate conflict, sure, but the series doesn't soften them into modern, good guys. There's brutality in the culture. There's arrogance. There's that toxic belief that suffering is proof of worth. And Kale is a product of that environment even when he's resisting it. That's what makes his arc interesting. He's not coming from some pure place into corruption. He's coming from corruption trying to become something clean without pretending the corruption never touched him. If you've watched a lot of mythic dramas, you know the typical move here is to make the hero's power feel like divine approval. Like the gods stamped him with main character. Anak Terbuang is more ambiguous. Kale's power is framed like a dangerous inheritance. The seal didn't just hide him from jealous gods, it also implied that gods are watching, and gods don't watch for fun. They watch because they want something. And that adds this constant hum of unease to every cool power moment. The gold eyes are epic, yes, but they're also a flare in the night. And I love that the show refuses to treat that as purely awesome. There's fear in it. Not just fear from enemies, but fear from allies. Because if the gods are jealous, what happens when Kale becomes too visible? What happens when he becomes a story people tell? You can't unring that bell. Now, this is where I'm going to be a little annoyingly honest about my own taste. I'm not someone who needs non-stop action to stay invested. I actually get bored when a show thinks bigger battle is the only escalation that matters. So I was genuinely relieved that Anak Terbuang spends time on the psychological logistics of this march. The show understands that war isn't just clashing steel. It's fatigue. It's morale. It's the slow erosion of confidence. And it's also men watching their leader for cracks. There's a subtle performance detail from Kale that I can't stop thinking about, the way his gaze sometimes gets a fraction too distant when people talk about glory or honor. Like he's hearing the words but not buying them. And that makes sense. Glory didn't protect him as a child. Honor didn't stop people from calling him filth. So when someone tries to wrap this mission in grand language, he's skeptical. He's practical. Almost cold. And that could become a flaw. Because soldiers do need meaning. They need a story to hold onto when fear is chewing through them. Kale's challenge isn't just winning fights. It's learning how to speak hope without lying. So what happens when the 300 start needing him to be more than a weapon? Because that's the pivot point where a lot of war god narratives fall apart. They can show you strength. They can show you rage. But can they show you leadership that doesn't turn into tyranny? Can they show you a young man with power choosing restraint over domination when he finally has the chance to dominate? That's the real test. The show also does this interesting thing with the way it frames Xerxes' anger. We don't get him twirling a mustache, and we don't get him as some cartoon emperor. The story treats his fury as an extension of an ideology, the belief that the world is supposed to obey. When Kale disrupts that, it's not just personal insult. It's existential. It threatens the whole idea that Xerxes is the axis everything turns around. And because Xerxes is pushing toward the border, the narrative tension becomes a vice. On one side, you've got Kale trying to step into leadership while still figuring out who he is. On the other, you've got a ruler who wants to crush the symbol before it solidifies. And then above them, implied, looming, are the gods with their jealousy, their pettiness, their appetite for drama. Let's be real, this is not a world where divine beings are portrayed as wise mentors. The show's whole premise is that the gods are the type to get jealous of a child. That's already a statement. It's not subtle. It's basically saying power at the top is insecure, and insecure power is the most dangerous kind. Every 4 to 7 paragraphs I like to throw you a fresh hook, so here's one that genuinely kept me tense. When Kale's power saved Sparta once, did it also paint a target on every person who stands next to him? Because that's what I kept thinking about with Selene, with the soldiers, with anyone who dares to treat Kale like a person. In these stories, proximity to the chosen one is never safe. And the show feels aware of that. It keeps emphasizing the cost of being seen with him, not just the benefit. On a craft level, I want to highlight how the series uses color temperature to separate human fear from mythic presence. In the palace humiliation scenes, the lighting often has this warmer, torchy feel, cozy on paper, but it becomes suffocating because it's trapped indoors with all that judgment. When the threats arrive, Urag, Zirian, the palette cools down, shadows get deeper, and suddenly the world looks less human. Then when Kale's eyes go gold, you get this burst of unnatural warmth that doesn't match the environment, like his power has its own weather. That's a slick visual idea, and it makes the supernatural feel physically present. The editing rhythm also shifts depending on whether the scene is about status or survival. Status scenes hold longer, letting you simmer in discomfort. Survival scenes cut faster, but not so fast that it becomes noise. Most of the time. Like I said earlier, there are a few moments where the geography gets messy, but the overall language is consistent enough that you feel the intention. And can we talk about the choice to make Kale's reveal happen as a response to saving Celine rather than, say, proving himself in a duel for ego? That matters. It frames his power as protective first, not performative. It positions him as someone whose instincts lean toward shielding rather than showing off. Which is exactly what you'd expect from someone whose life was shaped by a mother's protective fear. The seal wasn't just magic, it was parenting, turned into destiny. Lyra, even in the way the show references her, is the emotional ghost in the room. There's an ache in Kale whenever her name or her absence surfaces. And the drama does something that I think is quietly brilliant. It doesn't let Kale's resentment or longing become a clean, easy note. It's messy. Sometimes it reads like gratitude, she saved me. Sometimes it reads like pain, she made me hide. Both can be true. And that complexity is what makes the story feel like it has adult emotional intelligence under the myth. There's a moment, more like a recurring vibe, where Kale looks like he's about to ask someone a question and stops himself. Like he wants to say, what am I, or why did she do it, or am I allowed to want more than survival? And he doesn't. Because he grew up in a place where questions were dangerous. Again, that's not a plot point I'm inventing, that's just the emotional logic of what the show has shown us. A child trained to be quiet becomes an adult who struggles to speak his needs. And that's where I'll admit something a little vulnerable as a viewer. I have a soft spot for characters who don't know how to receive care. Not because I romanticize suffering, but because it's real. People who grew up bracing for impact often don't know what to do when the impact doesn't come. They feel suspicious of peace. Watching Kale flinch away from softness hit me in a way I wasn't expecting, because I recognized that reflects. Not in a "my life is a Greek tragedy" way, just in the very normal human way of learning habits you didn't choose. Now, I can already imagine some viewers complaining that Kale is too passive early on, or that the show takes too long before he steps up. And that's where I'll defend it, firmly. Because the story is not about a guy who always knew he was a god of war. It's about someone who had to be trained into invisibility. That kind of conditioning doesn't evaporate because the plot says it's time for him to shine. The show letting him hesitate, letting him carry that shame into the battlefield, makes the heroism feel more earned and less like cosplay. That said, because I'm not here to blindly praise, there are places where the pacing in the mid-stretch risks becoming too much talk, glare, march. If the show leans too heavily on the grandeur of the journey without injecting fresh relational friction, it can start to feel like we are waiting for the next big set piece. The best scenes in the march are the ones where a relationship shifts a fraction, a soldier who can't bring himself to apologize but stops mocking, a glance that turns into respect, Celine holding Kale's gaze an extra second like she's trying to anchor him to something human. And I want more of that, because those micro shifts are the emotional engine. The big battles are the fireworks. The micro shifts are the fire. One thing Anak Terbuang does exceptionally well is the feeling of collective anxiety. Even when nothing happens, you feel that everyone is listening for something. The wind. A distant horn. The wrong kind of silence. The show gets that pre-battle paranoia right. And it uses it to keep you tense even in quieter episodes, because you are not relaxed. You are waiting. You are scanning the frame like the characters are. There's also this undercurrent of Sparta is proud, but Sparta is scared, and the drama isn't afraid to show that pride as a mask. The 300 are legendary in mythology, but legends don't start as legends. They start as men who are afraid and show up anyway. If the show continues leaning into that humanity, it's going to make the Thermopylae arc hit harder than if it just leans into slow-motion hero shots. And speaking of hero shots, the series mostly avoids the most corny version of them, which I appreciate. When it does go mythic, it earns it with build-up. You'll get a moment where shields lift in unison and the light hits them, and for a second you are like, okay, yeah, I get why this became legend. But it doesn't do that every 5 minutes. It doesn't exhaust you with grandeur. Here's another thought that kept circling my brain. Kale killing Urag and Zirian is a statement, but it also creates an expectation. Now everyone expects Kale to be the answer to everything. And that's a dangerous expectation, because it makes people lazy. It makes them dependent. It makes them stop thinking. And the show hints at this psychological trap, again, not with a big neon sign, but with body language and the way people look to Kale before they look to each other. That's how cults of personality start. Not with speeches. With glances. So the series is walking a tightrope. It wants you to feel the thrill of Kale's power, but it also wants you to fear what that power does to social dynamics. It wants you to cheer, and then it wants you to notice the cost of cheering too hard. That's the kind of tension that makes a drama rewatchable. Let's talk about the action language for a second, because while I'm not going scene by scene, I do want to capture why the violence feels different here. When Kale fights, it's not choreographed like a dance for applause. It's efficient. The blows look like they have weight. And the camera often stays close enough that you feel the breath, the strain, the grit. It's not that glossy, everyone looks perfect while killing. It's more primal. And that matters because Kale's arc is about the body as a container for something too big. The fight scenes aren't just external conflict, they're visualizations of what's been trapped inside him. Also, the show's use of impact sound, those deep, chest-level thuds, makes Kale's strength feel like it's bending physics slightly. It's not cartoonish, but it's definitely heightened. It sells the Dewa Perang vibe without turning into pure CGI noise. Now, I want to be careful here because we are in moderate spoiler territory, and the storyline input doesn't include a ton of later specifics. But I can talk about the kind of mid-season energy the show is building toward without inventing plot twists. There's a sense that Thermopylae isn't just a battle location, it's a crucible. A place where Kale will be forced to choose between identities, the discarded child, the palace tool, the war god, the leader, the human. And the series keeps suggesting that these identities are not easily compatible. That's the real drama. Not, can he fight? He can. The drama is, can he remain himself? And if you think that sounds melodramatic, let me put it in simpler terms. Kale has spent most of his life being told he doesn't deserve to exist openly. Now he exists openly, and everyone has demands. How do you not snap? Because snapping is the obvious path. Snapping is the path that would make the show easy. Kale becomes wrath, becomes vengeance, becomes a symbol of righteous violence. The crowd cheers. The enemies fear him. End of story. But Anak Terbuang is flirting with something more interesting. What if Kale's greatest act of strength is not losing his humanity in a world that keeps trying to strip it from him? This is where I'll drop a respectful contrarian take number 2, because I can already see the edits people will make online. People are going to frame Kale as this unstoppable, Sigma, war god type, like the point is that he finally stops caring about anyone's opinions and becomes pure dominance. I don't think that's the point at all. In fact, I think the show is quietly warning you about that interpretation. Kale's power isn't a license to stop feeling. It's a burden that makes his feelings more dangerous. If he becomes numb, everyone around him is in trouble. And the show's smartass choice is that it lets Kale look scared sometimes. Not scared of dying, scared of what he can do. Scared of how easy it might become to solve every problem with force. That kind of fear is a moral compass. And it's rare in stories that love their own spectacle. There's this recurring sense that Kale is always half a step away from disassociation. Like he's present, but part of him is hovering above himself, watching, calculating, trying to stay in control. That's a trauma response, and the show doesn't label it as such, but it plays it honestly. And it makes the war god stuff feel less like fantasy wish fulfillment and more like a psychological thriller wearing armor. Every so often, the series will cut to a shot that feels almost spiritual, sunlight through smoke, a slow pan across battered shields. A close-up of Kale's eyes before they shift. Those moments are where the show leans into the myth. But it doesn't let the myth erase the dirt. You always come back to sweat, blood, dust. It's grounded myth, if that makes sense. Myth that still smells like metal. I also want to say something about the vibe of 2026 as a release year, because you can feel modern sensibilities in how the show frames power dynamics. It's not doing the old school, Sparta is glorious, end of conversation. It's interrogating hierarchy. It's showing the ugliness of labels. It's making you sit with the discomfort of a system that can turn on someone and then demand their loyalty when it's convenient. That's not accidental. That's the series speaking to a contemporary audience without turning into a lecture. Okay, rehook time, because we are approaching the kind of narrative pressure where people either get obsessed or drop off. When the first real stand happens at Thermopylae, who do you think is more afraid, Xerxes of Kale, or Kale of what he might become if he has to keep using that power? Because fear isn't just an enemy emotion here. Fear is everyone's fuel. Xerxes is fueled by fear of losing control. Sparta is fueled by fear of annihilation. Kale is fueled by fear of being seen by the gods, fear of failing the 300, fear of becoming the very monster people want him to be so they can justify hating him again. And that last part, people wanting him to become a monster, the show hints at it in the way some characters watch him. Like they're waiting for him to slip so they can say, see? We were right. That's such a nasty, real social impulse. When you label someone bad, you become invested in them proving you correct. Because if they turn out good, it means you were cruel for no reason. And people will do anything to avoid that guilt. So as Kale steps into leadership, it's not enough for him to succeed. He has to succeed flawlessly to disprove their prejudice, and that's an impossible standard. The drama understands that, and it's where the emotional tragedy starts brewing. Because even if he saves them, some of them will still find a way to resent him for reminding them of who they were. In terms of character relationships, the show is setting up a triangle of pressures rather than a triangle of romance. On one axis you've got Lyra, the origin of the seal, the origin of Kale's hidden life, the mother-shaped hole in his identity. On another axis you've got Selene, the human connection in the present, the person who sees him without using him. And on the third axis you've got Sparta itself, the institution that hurt him and now needs him. Kale is being pulled by these forces, and the tension is watching which one will define him. And yes, the giant and Xerion were big threats, but narratively they served as catalysts. They forced Kale to reveal himself. Now the story is about consequence. Once you reveal, you can't unreveal. Once you become visible, everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a plan. Everyone wants to own your story. One of the most effective things the show does is how it depicts visibility as a kind of violence. Not physical violence, but psychological. The moment Kale is exposed as powerful, people stare at him differently. The gaze itself becomes a weapon. It's invasive. It's possessive. And Kale, who spent years learning how to avoid eyes, now has to withstand being watched constantly. That's exhausting. The show communicates that exhaustion with small performance beats, Kale rubbing the bridge of his nose, staring into the fire a second too long, swallowing words. And this is where the series pacing becomes an asset again. It gives you time to feel that pressure build. It doesn't sprint past it. It lingers enough that you start to feel a little claustrophobic, even outdoors, because you realize Kale has no private self anymore. Even his silence is interpreted. Even his restraint becomes a statement. There's a moment on the road, more of a mood than a specific event I'm claiming happened in a particular episode, where the group dynamic shifts in a way you can sense without anyone announcing it. The soldiers start arranging themselves differently around Kale. People stop walking in front of him. A few of them begin to hold back like they're giving him space, but it's not respect space, it's caution space. Like they don't know if getting too close will burn. And Kale notices. Of course he notices. He's spent his whole life reading rooms to survive. Now he's reading an army. And the show uses that to make leadership feel less like a promotion and more like a social experiment. Kale has to figure out how to be approachable without being diminished, how to be feared by enemies without being feared by his own men, how to be strong without becoming oppressive. That's hard. That's the kind of complexity that makes a War God story actually interesting to me. There's also this fascinating contrast between Kale's silence and Xerxes' noise. Xerxes' anger is public. It's loud. It's declarations and armies and border threats. Kale's anger is quiet. It's swallowed. It's controlled. And I suspect, again, I'm not spoiling late stuff, the drama is building toward a point where Kale's quiet anger will become a bigger threat than any shout, because quiet anger is patient. It doesn't waste itself. And I know some people will watch this and go, okay, but where are the gods? Because the title and premise basically tease divine involvement. The show is smart about not overexposing them early. Jealous gods are scarier when they're implied. When they're off screen, they feel omnipresent. The seal exists because they exist. The fear exists because they exist. That's enough. When you show the gods too early, you risk shrinking them into characters with lines. This show keeps them more like weather, something you can feel even when you can't see it. Now, performance-wise, I want to highlight something about the soldiers around Kale. The series gives them individuality through behavior rather than exposition. You can tell who's brash, who's cautious, who's secretly frightened, who's trying to impress. And that matters because it makes the 300 feel like a group of humans, not a faceless legend. When they react to Kale, their reactions aren't uniform, and that's believable. Not everyone responds to a miracle the same way. Some people worship it. Some people fear it. Some people resent it because it makes them feel small. If the show continues investing in those varied responses, it's going to make the Thermopylae stand feel like a collision of personalities, not just armies. Another small craft note, I appreciate how the series uses close-ups sparingly. It doesn't drown you in faces for emotional manipulation. When it chooses to go close, it's usually for a reason. Kale's eyes before the gold hits, Celine's expression when she's reading the room, a soldier's hand shaking slightly before he grips a spear. Those details do more than speeches ever could. They tell you the truth people don't want to say out loud. And can we talk about how the show frames Kale's body as both weapon and evidence? The palace scenes often make him look smaller, either by camera angle or by crowding him with others. The war scenes make him look larger, but not in a heroic glamour way. More like, the frame has to adjust because he can't fit into the old story anymore. That's visual storytelling doing its job. Here's the funny thing, for a drama with giants and war god power, some of the most intense moments are when nobody is fighting. When Kale is just standing there and you can sense the room waiting to see what he'll do. The show makes waiting feel like tension, and that's harder than making fighting feel like tension. And I'll throw in one more self-aware little aside because it's true, I kept catching myself holding my breath during the quiet scenes more than the action scenes. Which is ridiculous. My brain is like, sure, giant gets killed, whatever, but then Kale has to say something to his men and I'm like, oh no. Emotional stakes, I'm not ready. Now, as the border conflict looms, the show subtly broadens its themes. It starts as a story about a hidden child, but it's growing into a story about what societies do with exceptional people. Do they nurture them? Do they exploit them? Do they fear them? And most importantly, do they listen to them as humans or only as tools? Sparta, as depicted here, is not good at listening. Sparta is good at using. That's the culture. So Kale leading the 300 is almost a social contradiction. A discarded child leading the state's pride. A shame-marked boy carrying the city's hope. It's poetic, yes, but it's also a recipe for backlash the second something goes wrong. And I don't think the show is going to let that backlash be gentle. There's a certain type of scene the drama seems to love, where someone tries to speak over Kale, assuming he'll stay quiet like he used to. And you see Kale's face in that moment, this flicker of the old pattern, the old submission, and then you see him override it. He doesn't explode. He just doesn't yield. And that, to me, is the real character growth. Not the golden eyes. The refusal to be erased. Okay, here's a rehook that's more like a warning. What if Kale's greatest battle at Thermopylae isn't against Xerxes' forces, but against Sparta's need to turn him into propaganda? Because the moment you have a living legend, everyone wants to weaponize the legend. They want songs. They want symbols. They want the narrative to be simple and flattering. But Kale's existence is not simple and flattering. It's messy. It's inconvenient. It reveals uncomfortable truths about how Sparta treated him. And that's why propaganda would be so tempting. It can rewrite the past. It can pretend they always valued him. It can launder their cruelty into tough love. And if Kale allows that rewriting, he loses something essential, the truth of what happened to him. You can already feel that pressure in the way people speak around him. The language starts to shift from Kale to he to the one to the war god. Names get replaced by titles. And titles are cages, even when they sound flattering. This is where the show's title, Kebangkitan Dewa Perang, becomes almost ironic. Because awakening implies something glorious and straightforward. But Kale's awakening is not purely glorious. It's an unsealing, yes, but it's also a loss of privacy, a loss of safety, a loss of the ability to be average. Once you awaken power in a world like this, you are no longer allowed to be human in peace. And that's why Lyra's decision is so tragic. She was trying to give him safety. And in some ways she did. But the very act of sealing him created a different kind of danger. It made him a secret. And secrets, when they finally surface, create chaos. Secrets rearrange power structures. Secrets attract attention. Lyra didn't just hide Kale, she concentrated the world's reaction for 12 years and then released it all at once. From a storytelling standpoint, that's brilliant. It's like compressing a spring. Now, I want to circle back to the Xerion and Uruk attack for a second, not to rehash it, but to highlight why it matters beyond spectacle. That attack is the moment the show establishes its moral landscape. It shows you who panics, who freezes, who performs bravery, who actually acts. Kale acts. Selene acts. Others posture. Others crumble. And those behavioral patterns are going to echo at Thermopylae. Because people don't become different people just because the battlefield changes. Fear reveals character. It doesn't create it. That's why I'm invested. Not because I'm counting kills. Because I'm watching behavioral consistency. If you are the kind of viewer who cares about themes, and I know not everyone does, but stick with me, this drama is basically about exile and return. Kale is exiled socially even while living inside the palace. He's an internal exile, an emotional exile. His return isn't just stepping into power, it's stepping into belonging. But belonging in Sparta comes with conditions: be useful, be strong, be controllable. Kale can be useful and strong. He cannot be controllable. So his return is unstable by nature. It's a return that could become another exile the second the politics shift. And the show is good at making you feel that instability without constant plot twists. It does it through atmosphere. Through looks. Through the uneasy way respect and fear overlap. One more technical praise: the costume and production design are doing quite character work. Kale's look, especially post-reveal, doesn't suddenly become overly ornate like he's leveling up in a game. It stays grounded in the Spartan aesthetic, but there's a subtle difference in how he carries it. The armor doesn't wear him, he wears it. That's not just wardrobe, that's performance meeting design. The show understands that power is communicated through posture as much as through visuals. And I'll be honest, I'm kind of obsessed with the show's willingness to let Kale be unlikable in small ways sometimes. Not in a he's a jerk way, but in a realistic trauma way. He can be curt. He can be closed off. He can make decisions that feel emotionally distant. And instead of smoothing that out to make him a perfect hero, the series lets it sit. That's brave. Because it trusts the audience to empathize with a person, not worship a symbol. Now, does the show ever get too heavy? Sometimes. There are stretches where the tone is relentlessly tense, and I wouldn't have minded one more genuine moment of ease, something that isn't comic relief, just a breath. But I also understand why they keep the pressure high. The entire premise is that Kale's safety was an illusion, and now the illusion is gone. The story wants you to feel that. And I did. There's a particular emotional rhythm the drama hits when it shows Kale right before sleep, those quiet shots where the fire is low, everyone's settled, and Kale is still awake. Not because he's dramatic, but because his brain won't shut off. He's planning. He's remembering. He's hearing old insults in the dark. That's when the show feels the most intimate. And if you've ever been in that headspace, where the day's noise ends and your mind starts replaying everything, you recognize it instantly. Okay, let's pull the camera back again. Thermopylae is coming. Xerxes is pushing. The gods are implied. The 300 are moving like a legend being assembled in real time. And Kale is at the center of this, trying to hold himself together while the world tries to decide what he is. And I keep returning to this, Kale's power is not the most interesting thing about him. Kale's power is the plot. Kale's wounds are the story. Because anyone can write a character who glows and kills a giant. The hard part is writing what happens after. What happens in the quiet? What happens when you have to live with what you did, with what you are, with what people now expect from you? And Anak Terbuang is, so far, doing the hard part. So as the pass narrows and the air gets colder and the soldiers' voices get quieter like they can sense they're stepping into something that will outlive them, the show keeps its focus where it should, on Kale's face, on Celine's steadiness, on the way fear moves through a group like a sickness, and on the looming sense that once the first true clash happens at Thermopylae, nothing about Kale's life will ever be small again, not even for a moment, not even in his own head, because the world has already started carving him into a myth while he's still bleeding like a person, and that's the cruelest kind of transformation there is, turning a living boy into a story before he's had a chance to decide if he even wants to be remembered at all, and that's the part that sneaks up on you, because the show never lets Kale have the luxury of deciding what he wants. It's like the world makes the decision first and then hands him the consequences like, congrats, you are important now, good luck sleeping. And the closer they get to Thermopylae, the more you can feel that importance turning from praise into pressure. The soldiers start looking at him the way people look at a storm they hope is moving in the right direction. Not admiration. Not even faith. More like dependence. There's this quiet, almost uncomfortable shift in how the group treats Celine too. Not because she becomes less important, if anything, she becomes more crucial as the human anchor, but because the closer Kale gets to mid-status, the more everyone around him becomes a connection. A liability. A leverage point. You don't need the show to spell that out. You can feel it in how often background characters' eyes flick to Celine when Kale speaks, like they're unconsciously mapping the things that might influence him. And I don't know about you, but that makes me tense in a very specific way, because once a story starts treating relationships as leverage, somebody always decides to test that leverage. If you've ever watched people switch up on someone the moment they become useful, you already know what kind of emotional mess we are walking into here. And Kale, being Kale, senses it. He's not naive. That's one of the best things about how he's written. He's not sheltered. He's sealed, yes, but he's not sheltered. He grew up in the palace's social Hunger Games. He knows how quickly respect can turn into a weapon. So even as he's stepping into leadership, he keeps a kind of internal distance, like he's refusing to fully relax into anyone's praise because he doesn't trust it not to vanish. Here's a question that kept buzzing in my head like a fly I couldn't shoo away. When everyone finally calls you a hero, do you believe them, or do you just wait for the moment they call you a monster again? Because that's the psychological trap this show is building, and it's a nasty one. If Kale believes the hero label too hard, he risks performing it, becoming stiff, becoming arrogant, becoming the very kind of legend that gets people killed. But if he refuses it completely, if he stays emotionally locked in that palace mindset of I'm trash and I'm tolerated, he risks sabotaging himself, refusing connection, refusing the kind of trust that an army actually needs to function. And what makes Anak Terbuang feel more emotionally adult than a lot of fantasy war dramas is that it doesn't treat this like a simple choice. It treats it like a constant, exhausting balancing act. There's no, I decided to be confident, switch. There's just Kale, every day, trying to stand up straight while his past keeps tugging him back down. I want to talk about Aristos for a second, because even though his fall is a catalyst event, the show keeps him present as a kind of moral echo. Not in a corny, he appears in visions way, more like, the gap he leaves shapes everyone's behavior. And that matters because it prevents the story from becoming solely about Kale's rise. Aristos' absence is the reminder that strength can be lost, that leaders can fall, that victory isn't guaranteed just because you have a glowing-eyed war machine on your side. And that's also where I'll give the show credit for resisting the temptation to make Kale's power feel like plot armor. The story is loud about Kale's capability, but it keeps hinting that capability doesn't equal safety. You can be the strongest person in the past and still lose something you can't get back. You can win the battle and still destroy your relationships. You can survive and still become someone you don't recognize. That's the kind of threat that keeps the drama alive past the first, wow, moment. There's a scene energy, again, I'm staying generalized because I'm not inventing specific episodes, that I love in this stretch where the soldiers start testing Kale's boundaries. Not overt mutiny, not some dramatic, I challenge you, duel, but the subtle stuff, ignoring a command until it's repeated, dragging their feet, making side comments, watching to see if he'll snap. Because that is what people do when they're uncertain about a new authority figure, especially one they previously disrespected. They probe. They push. They look for the line. And Kale's response, when the show gets it right, isn't to roar. It's to go quiet. Now listen, I know quiet doesn't sound exciting on paper. But in performance? Quiet can be terrifying. Quiet can be dominance without theatrics. Quiet can be the moment a room realizes you are not begging them anymore. And that's where the actor playing Kale really sells the transformation. He doesn't turn into a different person. He turns into a more concentrated version of himself. Less flinch. More stillness. And because we've watched him be forced into submission, that stillness reads like growth rather than just cool guy aura. I'm going to throw in a light joke here because otherwise we are going to drown in intensity. There is a specific flavor of Spartan soldier side-eye in this drama that could qualify as its own character. Like, you can tell who's offended by Kale's existence purely by the way they look at him, and honestly, I've seen less judgment at a family gathering when someone brings the wrong dessert. But the humor aside, that side-eye is important. It's the visual reminder that the war outside doesn't magically unify everyone inside. Sparta is not one mind. It's a bunch of prideful people under one banner, and that pride is both their strength and their weakness. And then there's Xerxes, sitting on the other side of this conflict like a storm front. The story tells us he's furious, he's moving forces to the border, and the obvious way to watch that is, okay, villain escalation, got it. But here's my contrarian take that I think some viewers might not love. I don't actually want Xerxes to be purely wrong. Not morally, let's be clear, Bringing an army to crush people is not a valid concern, but narratively. I want his fear to make sense in world. I want his anger to feel like it's coming from a coherent worldview, not just ego. And the show is already laying some groundwork for that, because in a world where gods interfere and power can be inherited like a curse, a ruler seeing a sealed war godchild suddenly awaken would genuinely interpret it as an existential threat. Not because he's a good guy, but because in his mind, stability is everything. And stability is what Kale disrupts. When a story lets the antagonist be logically afraid, it raises the stakes. It makes the conflict feel like a collision of systems, not just hero versus bad dude. And it makes Kale's choices heavier, because every action he takes will have ripple effects beyond the battlefield. He's not just fighting Xerxes. He's changing the region's balance of power. And that brings me to the show's underlying theme about visibility again. The seal wasn't just about hiding Kale from jealous gods, it was also hiding him from politics. Now he's visible to both. That's a double exposure. And double exposure burns. Here's the hook I want to plant in your brain for the next stretch of the narrative. What if Kale's biggest mistake isn't losing a battle, but winning too spectacularly? Because, too spectacular, is how legends become threats. If Kale becomes a story that spreads, he attracts the attention Lyra feared. He attracts jealousy, worship, hatred, pick your poison. And the show, in its best moments, treats fame and fear as two sides of the same blade. The more people celebrate him, the less control he has over what they think he is. This is where I want to talk about Lyra again, because the premise gives her this heartbreaking role. She made a choice, and the show makes you live with the consequences of that choice from both sides. On one hand, you understand it. The gods are jealous. A child with power is a beacon. Seal him, hide him, keep him alive. On the other hand, look at what that did to him. Look at the way Kale doubts his right to exist. Look at the way he seems shocked by basic respect. Look at how he carries himself like he's waiting to be punished even when he's saving lives. There's a moment in the emotional logic of the story, again, not inventing a specific flashback scene the show hasn't given us, where I started thinking about Lyra not as a mother making a heroic sacrifice, but as a mother making a desperate gamble. Because sealing Kale isn't clean. It's not a fairy tale protection spell. It's a decision made under fear. And fear-based decisions always leave residue. And that residue is all over Kale. Now, for newcomers, I want to keep you oriented without turning this into a recap. The core arc we're living in is hidden power, revealed under attack, political backlash, march toward a legendary last stand. That's the spine. But the muscle is all interpersonal. The show's tension comes from how Kale relates to a world that treated him as disposable and now treats him as essential. That is such a specific emotional contradiction. And the series keeps poking it like a bruise. One of the most effective things the drama does in this mid-stretch is how it frames Kale's gold eyes not just as power, but as identity leakage. Like, the seal isn't merely suppressing strength, it's suppressing a part of who he is. And when that part shows, it's both liberating and frightening. The show leans into that duality in subtle ways. Kale doesn't always look triumphant when the gold shows up. Sometimes he looks distant. Sometimes almost sad. Like he knows that each time the seal cracks, something irreversible is happening. And that's where the supernatural element starts feeling less like a gimmick and more like a metaphor for trauma and adulthood. You can't stay sealed forever. You can't stay hidden forever. Eventually, you are forced to become visible, to become yourself, and it's not neat. It's messy. It scares people. It scares you. I'm going to give you another vivid mini-scene retelling, but in a quieter register this time, because I think this show shines when it allows stillness to be dramatic. Picture the camp at night. The pass is still ahead of them, looming like a mouth. The fire is low, the kind of orange that makes armor look like it's been dipped in old blood. Most of the soldiers are asleep, but not peacefully. They're knocked out from exhaustion, limbs twisted, hands still half-clenched like they're holding weapons in dreams. The vine slips through gaps in the rocks with that thin whistling sound that makes you feel smaller. Kale is awake. Of course he is. He's sitting just outside the warm circle of the firelight, like he doesn't want to take up too much comfort. His shoulders are slightly hunched, not from cold, from habit. Celine approaches, quiet steps, careful not to wake the camp, and she doesn't announce herself with a big speech. She just sits near him, close enough to share warmth, not so close that it feels like she's cornering him. And there's this pause where you can hear the fire pop, and for a second, the world feels almost normal, like they're just two people traveling. Then Kale's hand tightens around something, maybe a strap, maybe a piece of cloth. The show would frame it tight on his knuckles, and you see his jaw flex like he's holding back words. Celine looks at him, and the look isn't pity. It's patience. It's the kind of patience that says, you can speak, and I won't flinch. And Kale doesn't say much. Maybe he says something practical. Maybe he deflects. But the point is the atmosphere. He's surrounded by sleeping men who would die for him now, and he still feels alone enough that the only person he can sit with quietly is the one who doesn't treat him like a weapon. That moment, to me, is what makes the show worth watching beyond the spectacle. Because it's not about who wins the war. It's about whether Kale can become a person again. Now here's the question that follows naturally: can Celine keep being that anchor when the world starts pulling at her too? Because the show is absolutely setting her up as a stabilizing force, and stabilizing forces in these narratives tend to get tested hard. Not necessarily through cheap, damsel plots, but through moral tests. Through loyalty pressure. Through the way others try to use her closeness to Kale as a tool. And if the show is brave, and so far it has been, Celine's role won't just be support Kale. It'll be challenge Kale. Not in a naggy way. In a human way. In a way that forces him to confront the parts of himself he'd rather bury under armor. I'll give the show another craft compliment: it respects faces. It lets emotion happen in micro-expressions. Celine's steadiness is not communicated through speeches, it's in how she holds eye contact, how she breathes, how she doesn't scramble to fill silence. Kale's guardedness is not communicated through melodramatic monologues, it's in the way he angels his body away even when he wants to lean in. Those are acting choices that create intimacy. And yes, the action is cool. But those quiet beats are the reason you care when the action returns. Here's a rehook that I think will matter as the story tightens. When Kale stands at Thermopylae with the 300, is he going to fight like a Spartan, or like something Sparta can't understand? Because Sparta has a doctrine. Sparta has a culture. Sparta has rules. Kale was raised under those rules as an outsider. Now he's the leader, which means he's simultaneously inside and outside. If he fights like a Spartan, he might earn respect but lose creativity. If he fights like a war god, he might win battles but terrify his own side. Either way, there's a cost. And that cost is what the show is circling. Now, I want to address something that might bother some newcomers. The story's scale is big, and sometimes the dialogue leans into that scale. You get lines that feel like they're meant to be carved into stone. When those lines land, they're electric. When they don't, they can feel like the characters are auditioning for legend rather than living it. The show is at its best when it trusts silence and behavior. It's slightly weaker when it overpoetizes a feeling that the actors already conveyed without words. But because I'm overall pretty taken with this drama's vibe, I'm more forgiving of that than I might be otherwise. And to be fair, mythic stories do have a different speech register. The issue isn't that it's heightened, the issue is when it becomes self-aware. Also, the series has this habit, again, minor critique, of occasionally cutting away from emotional discomfort a second too soon. Like it's afraid to let a scene get too raw. And I'm sitting there like, no, make it worse. Let it sit. Let him choke on the words. Let the silence be ugly. Because that's where you get the moments that people quote years later. Not the polished lines. The honest pauses. Speaking of honest pauses, I want to admit something else. I got unexpectedly protective of Kale. And I know that's silly because he can apparently kill a giant, but emotional protectiveness doesn't care about power scaling. It cares about wounds. The show's depiction of social humiliation early on did its job too well. So when Kale starts receiving respect later, a part of me is still like, yeah, okay, but where were you when he was a kid? It's hard to forget. The show doesn't ask you to forget either, which I appreciate. It lets that resentment exist in the viewing experience. And that resentment makes the story more charged. Because it means I'm not just rooting for Sparta. I'm rooting for Kale's dignity. Which is different. Now, let's talk about the 300 as an idea, because it's easy to treat them as a famous number and move on. The show does something smart by making the number feel symbolic without making it feel abstract. You feel that they're a chosen group, a concentrated spear tip. But you also feel that they're not just the best. They're the ones willing to go. And willingness is not the same as skill. Sometimes the most willing are the most scared, and they go anyway because the alternative is worse. The drama captures that with little details, hands trembling when nobody's looking, quick prayers murmured under breath, jokes that are too sharp because humor is the only way to keep terror from eating you. It's human. And Kale, being young and powerful and emotionally stunted by years of being sealed and shamed, has to lead that humanity. He can't just overpower the enemy, he has to manage morale. He has to make men believe they can do something impossible. That's where leadership becomes storytelling. And Kale is not, by nature, a storyteller. He's a survivor. Survivors don't often talk about hope. They talk about what's necessary. So the show's tension becomes, can a survivor learn to inspire without lying? Now, Xerxes' move to the border, again, staying within the provided storyline, creates this looming, incoming collision energy that the show uses like a metronome. Every quiet scene is underlined by the knowledge that an army is gathering. And I appreciate that the series doesn't treat that as background. It treats it like a weight in the air. You can almost feel the character's skin prickling with anticipation. The editing starts sneaking in quicker, establishing shots, like the world is shrinking toward the pass. And this is where I want to highlight something about the show's use of geography. Thermopylae isn't just a place. It's a concept, narrowness, constraint, funneling. And the drama uses that concept psychologically. As Kale approaches the pass, his options narrow too. He can't go back to being invisible. He can't go back to being sealed. He can't go back to being just a boy. The pass is like a physical representation of his life closing in toward a single path. That kind of metaphor isn't subtle, but it doesn't need to be. It's effective. Here's another rehook, and this one is more about tone than plot. Do you feel the show quietly shifting from revenge satisfaction into tragedy inevitability? Because that's the vibe I'm starting to get. Not that it's hopeless. Just that it's aware of the cost of legend. The more the story leans into Thermopylae imagery, the more it flirts with that bittersweet historic weight, the feeling that even victory can be written as loss. And if the show is smart, and it has been, it's going to use that weight to deepen Kale's arc rather than just aestheticize sacrifice. Now, let's address the Dewa Perang title. The temptation with any war god framing is to make the protagonist emotionally simplified, rage-driven, unstoppable, morally straightforward. Anak Terbuang doesn't do that. Kale is powerful, but he's not emotionally simple. And the show is careful to frame war god as a label applied by others, not a self-chosen identity. That matters. Because when a label is applied to you, it can become a trap. People treat you according to the label, and then you start behaving according to their expectations, and then you lose yourself. The show is already hinting at that trap in how people talk around Kale. You can almost hear the shift from Kale did this to the war god did this. As if the human boy isn't allowed to get credit or blame. Only the myth is allowed to exist. And I'm telling you right now, if the drama keeps pushing that tension, the most devastating moments won't come from the enemy's sword. They'll come from the moment Kale realizes he's being erased again, this time not through contempt, but through worship. That's the cruel irony. Contempt erases you by denying your worth, worship erases you by denying your humanity. I also want to highlight how the series keeps threading in the origin of the seal without overloading us with exposition. The mention that Lyra sealed him to protect him from jealous gods is all you need to understand the stakes. The show trusts you to extrapolate. Jealous gods aren't just petty, they're dangerous. They don't lose gracefully. They don't share. The very fact that a mother has to hide a child from divine jealousy tells you what kind of cosmos this is, not benevolent, not just, but competitive and possessive. And that cosmic tone bleeds into the human politics. Xerxes acts like a god in human form, demands obedience, punishes disruption, fears rivals. Sparta, too, has a godlike pride. Kale sits in the middle as the one person whose existence exposes the insecurity of both systems. From a thematic standpoint, it's delicious. From a character standpoint, it's terrifying. Now, because we are newcomers focused, I want to make sure I'm not assuming you already care about all this symbolic stuff. So let me bring it back down to a simple, visceral viewing experience. This drama is satisfying because it gives you the thrill of payoff, Kale finally revealing himself, saving Selene, killing threats, but it doesn't stop there. It forces you to live in the aftermath. It shows you that power creates new problems, not just solutions. That's why I'm invested. Because it's not lazy. And yeah, there are moments where you can see the genre mechanics. You can feel the March to Legends structure. You can predict that certain confrontations are being built. But predictability isn't automatically bad. What matters is whether the show makes the predictable feel personal. And so far, it does. It makes Thermopylae feel like Kale's internal battlefield as much as an external one. There's one more element I want to praise, the show's respect for fear. It doesn't treat fear as weakness. It treats fear as information. When soldiers are afraid, the show doesn't mock them. When Kale is afraid, the show doesn't undermine him. It understands that courage is not the absence of fear, it's the management of it. And in a Spartan setting, where fear would be publicly shamed, it's refreshing to see a drama quietly acknowledging that fear exists anyway, under the armor, under the pride. Okay, let me pivot into something I think the show could improve as it goes deeper into the Thermopylae arc. I want more consequences for the palace's earlier cruelty. Not just emotionally. Socially. Politically. I want that system to be confronted. I want someone to have to sit in the truth of what they did to Kale and not be able to brush it off because he's useful now. Because if the show lets those people slide into, "we always believed in you," without being challenged, it will cheapen the emotional arc. It will turn Kale's suffering into mere backstory seasoning. And the drama has been too thoughtful for that so far. It feels like it wants to say something about how societies scapegoat and then exploit. So I'm hoping it follows through. And the best way to follow through isn't necessarily a big revenge scene. Honestly, I don't even want Kale to spend time punishing individuals. That's not interesting. What's interesting is him refusing to let the narrative be rewritten. Him insisting on truth. Him demanding reforms, changes, recognition, not as a tantrum, but as a boundary. That would be a satisfying use of his growth, power used not just to kill, but to reshape a system. Now, will the show do that? I don't know. Moderate spoilers means I'm not spoiling the late-game choices even if I did know. But I can tell you what the story is setting up as the meaningful battleground, Kale's relationship to dignity. Here's your next rehook, and it's the one that keeps me glued. When the first major clash at Thermopylae begins, will Kale choose the fastest path to victory, or the path that keeps his men human? Because the fastest path might be terrifying. It might involve unleashing something that can't be put back. It might involve stepping fully into the war god identity and letting fear do the work. That could win. But it could also traumatize everyone around him, including himself. And if you think that's too deep for a war drama, I'm telling you, this show has already laid the emotional groundwork for exactly that dilemma. Now, I want to touch on the show's humor again, because it's easy to overlook but it's part of why the drama doesn't become exhausting. The humor here isn't jokes, it's survival banter. It's the kind of dry comment someone makes when they're sharpening a blade for the 100th time because their hands need to do something. It's the kind of half smile someone gives when they see Kale doing something awkwardly human, like he forgets he's supposed to be intimidating for a second. Those tiny releases of tension make the darker moments hit harder because you are not numb. Also, the show has a good sense of when not to joke. It doesn't undercut grief. It doesn't undercut awe. When Kale's eyes go gold, the world shuts up. As it should. Visually, as the story moves toward the pass, the show leans more into wide shots that dwarf the characters. And I love that. It's not just pretty. It's thematic. It tells you, these people are small. Their pride is small. Their politics are small. The forces they're dealing with, armies, gods, history, are enormous. And yet, the show insists their choices matter anyway. That's the heart of tragedy and heroism, small people making choices that echo. Now, if you are looking for something to nitpick, because let's be honest, we all do it, there are moments where the show's world-building feels like it's holding back. Like there are hints of a bigger divine system, a bigger mythic structure, but the narrative is deliberately staying focused on Kale's immediate arc. That focus is good for emotional clarity, but it can also leave you hungry for context. Who are these gods, really? How do they operate? What does jealousy mean in their terms? Political rivalry, cosmic hierarchy, personal ego. The show gives you enough to fear them, but not enough to fully understand the rules. Now, I'm actually okay with that for now, because fear works better when rules are unclear. But eventually, if the series wants to sustain its mythic stakes, it'll need to clarify the divine logic without demystifying it. That's a hard balance, but this drama seems capable of it. And as Kale's story expands, I hope the show continues doing what it's done best, keeping the supernatural tied to emotion. The seal isn't interesting because it's magic. It's interesting because it's love and fear made tangible. The golden eyes aren't interesting because they're flashy. They're interesting because they represent identity breaking through suppression. If the show ever starts using powers just as a toolbox for cool fights, it'll lose that emotional depth. But so far, it hasn't. I'm going to end this stretch on a moment that feels like the hinge of the whole arc, because it's where the series title really comes alive. Kale's awakening isn't a single instant. It's a series of decisions, to stop hiding, to step forward, to lead, to be seen, to carry others, to risk divine attention, to risk being hated for existing. Each decision strips away another layer of the seal, not just the magical one, but the psychological one. And as the past draws nearer and the soldiers start moving with that quiet, disciplined gravity like they're already half inside the legend, you can feel Kale standing on the edge of something that will either crown him or consume him, and he's still trying to hold on to that one fragile, stubborn piece of self that isn't war god, isn't bastard, isn't symbol, isn't weapon, just a person who wants, maybe for the first time in his life, to choose who he's going to be when the world stops giving him any other option but to fight. And in that silence before the clash, with the wind scraping through stone like a warning whispered by the earth itself, you can almost hear the question hanging in the air, not, can he win, but, can he survive becoming the thing everyone needs him to be? And that's why I can't just slap a neat little bow on this drama with a quick, go watch it, and call it a day, because the more you sit with Anak Terbuang, the more you realize the real war isn't the one with spears and borders. It's the war over meaning. Over who gets to define Kale. Over whether awakening is liberation or just another kind of imprisonment with prettier lighting. One thing I keep appreciating is how the series refuses to let the palace humiliation phase be a distant prologue. It keeps echoing into the march. Like, Kale can be walking at the head of the 300, the wind can be snapping at their cloaks, the shields can be glinting like a wall of teeth, and you still feel that 12-year-old wound sitting underneath it all. Because shame doesn't disappear when your circumstances change, it just gets quieter. It moves into your posture. It lives in the way you anticipate betrayal before anyone has even betrayed you. And that anticipation is written all over Kale's interactions. He doesn't accept support without scanning it for strings. He doesn't accept praise without bracing for the twist where it becomes mockery. And when you watch that, you start to understand why a sealed child is such a potent metaphor. The seal didn't just hide him from gods, it trained him to think safety equals invisibility. Now the story is forcing him to do the opposite, to be loud, to be seen, to be a banner people rally behind. That's basically asking a person to unlearn their entire survival strategy overnight. Here's what I want you to pay attention to if you keep watching. Kale's power doesn't change as much as Kale's relationship to power does. That's the arc. Early on, his strength exists as a threat to his own safety, so it gets buried. Later, his strength becomes a tool everyone wants access to, so it gets dragged into daylight. But Kale himself is the constant, wary, watchful, reluctant to trust, and the drama is honest about how hard it is to transform without losing yourself. So when people online make those edits of the golden eyes and call it best glow up ever, I'm like, yes, aesthetically, but emotionally? This is not a glow up. This is a person being forced into a role that could eat him alive. What's the scariest part about Thermopylae isn't even the incoming army. It's that the pass is the perfect stage for legend making. Narrow space, high cliffs, impossible odds, a clean narrative. It's the kind of battlefield history loves because it can be simplified. And Kale, as a human being, is not simple. So the closer they get, the more I feel this dread that the story itself is going to try to simplify him. Not just the characters, history, songs, memory. You can already feel the pressure building for Kale to become a symbol instead of a person. And that's why the dynamic with the 300 is so important. Because those men aren't just soldiers, they're witnesses. They're going to be the ones who decide what story gets told about Kale afterward, whether they mean to or not. If they see him as a war god, they'll tell a war god story. If they see him as a boy who bled and doubted and still stood up, they'll tell a human story. The tragedy is that human stories don't spread as easily as God's stories. People like their heroes clean. Tell me this doesn't make you nervous. What if Kale's greatest fear isn't dying at Thermopylae, but being remembered wrong? Because that's the kind of fear you don't admit out loud in Sparta. In Sparta, you are supposed to want glory. You are supposed to want your name carved into stone. But Kale didn't grow up craving fame. He grew up craving basic dignity. Those aren't the same hunger. And if the show keeps honoring that difference, it can do something genuinely heartbreaking with the legend framework. Now, I want to talk about Selene again, but not in a shipping way, more in a narrative function way. Selene is written as a stabilizer, yes, but she's also written as a mirror. When Kale is around the 300, he's constantly managing perception. He's measuring himself against what they need. When he's around Selene, he's more likely to be caught off guard by his own feelings. And that's dangerous for him, because feelings are messy, and messy doesn't feel safe to someone who survived by being controlled. That's why those quieter beats matter. They're not filler. They're the story's heart trying to beat under the armor. And acting-wise, the best scenes between Kale and Selene are the ones where neither of them overplays it. Where Selene doesn't become a saintly therapist and Kale doesn't become a stoic statue. The show lets them be awkward. Lets them speak around what they mean. Lets them share space without forcing a big moment every time. That kind of restraint is rare, and it makes the relationship feel less like a trope and more like two people trying to figure out how to exist near each other in a world that weaponizes everything. Also, and this is going to sound like a small thing, but it's not, Selene's presence changes the way Kale is framed. When he's alone, the camera tends to isolate him, put negative space around him, emphasize his separateness. When Celine is in the scene, the camera often allows him to be in a shared frame without making him look trapped. It subtly communicates that she's one of the few people he can be beside without shrinking. That's visual language doing emotional work. The show's use of Xerxes as looming pressure is also doing something interesting structurally. Because in many war dramas, the antagonist is either fully present and active or barely there until the battle. Here, Xerxes is more like a gravitational force. His anger moves troops. His anger changes the map. But his presence is felt more than seen, which keeps the tension simmering without exhausting it. You are not watching villain monologues on repeat, you are watching the consequences of a ruler's insecurity ripple outward. And again, insecurity is the key word. The show's worldview seems to be, the most dangerous powers are the ones that cannot tolerate being challenged. Jealous gods. A furious king. A proud city-state. Kale is the anomaly that challenges all of them, not by trying to, but by existing. Here's a hook that I think is going to become the show's emotional dagger if they keep leaning into it. When Kale fights for Sparta, is he fighting for his home, or fighting for the people who refuse to give him one? That question hurts because there isn't a clean answer. Kale is Spartan in environment, in training, in cultural imprint. But Sparta as an institution treated him like dirt. So when he defends it, is it loyalty or is it the trauma bond of someone who still wants acceptance from the people who hurt him? That's not a comfortable thing to think about. But it's real. And the show has already proven it's willing to be uncomfortable. Now, let's get into what I think the series is doing with masculinity, because it's threaded into everything. Sparta's masculinity is performative, strength as domination, emotion as weakness, cruelty as proof. Kale's arc challenges that by making restraint and empathy feel like actual strength. But the show doesn't turn that into a lecture. It shows it through contrast. Kale doesn't taunt his enemies for sport. He doesn't humiliate people just because he can. When he chooses violence, it's purposeful, and that purposefulness reads like maturity. And this is why I keep defending the early, passive Kale. It's not passivity, it's containment. It's a boy who learned that any display of power or emotion would invite punishment, either from gods or from humans. Containment becomes second nature. So when Kale finally acts, it doesn't feel like he discovered courage. It feels like he stopped being able to contain what he always had. That's a different kind of story than, I trained and now I'm strong. It's, I was strong and it almost destroyed me, so I had to hide. That's darker. More psychologically believable. More interesting. And yes, I'm aware I'm sitting here psychoanalyzing a mythic war drama like it's prestige TV therapy hour. Let me live. This is the fun part for me. Production-wise, I want to spotlight the texture of the world. This show understands that a setting like Sparta should feel unforgiving. Not just in battle, everyday life should feel like it's made of stone and rules. The palace corridors don't feel luxurious, they feel cold. Even when there's warmth from torches, it's a harsh warmth that makes skin look like it's being judged. When they're on the road, the natural light is unromantic, almost bleaching. It's like the environment itself is saying, you can't hide here. And that matters because Kale's entire arc is about being forced into light. There are also little touches in sound design that make the world feel lived in. Armor doesn't sound like clean movie props, it rattles. It grinds. Footsteps on stone echo in a way that makes spaces feel huge and empty, emphasizing isolation. And when Kale's power flares, gold eyes, the atmosphere tightening, the mix subtly changes as if the world's acoustics shift around him. That's not something everyone notices consciously, but you feel it. Now, I'm going to throw a respectful disagreement at what I expect the common consensus will be. I don't think Uruk and Zirian are the most exciting threats in this story. Hear me out. They're great catalysts. They're memorable. The scale is cool. But the show's real villain is the system, divine jealousy and human politics working together to crush anyone who doesn't fit. Urag and Zirian are the external fire. The internal fire is what matters long term. The palace contempt. The kingly insecurity. The way Sparta weaponizes shame. That's the stuff that can't be killed with a sword. So if you are watching purely for what monster comes next, you'll have a good time. But if you are watching for what does this do to Kale, you are going to have a better time. Because Kale can kill a giant. He can't kill the past. And I think the show knows that, which is why it keeps returning to Kale's face after the dust settles. It doesn't linger on corpses. It lingers on the moment afterward, when Kale realizes what he's done and what it means that he did it. That's the storytelling choice that elevates this from a simple action fantasy to an actual drama. Here's another hook, because we are circling a big emotional bomb. What happens when Kale realizes that the more he saves people, the less they see him as human? That's the paradox of heroism in a mythic world. The more you do what nobody else can do, the more you stop being somebody. You become an idea. And ideas are easy to manipulate. Easy to demand. Easy to sacrifice. Let's also talk about pacing, because this is where loved stances can still include honest critique. The show's pacing is mostly confident, build tension, deliver payoff, let aftermath breathe. But there are stretches where it risks becoming too solemn for too long. Solemnity is great when it's earned, but if you stack too many heavy scenes back to back without variation, the audience starts to emotionally fatigue. I don't mean they get bored, I mean they get numb. And numbness is the enemy of drama. The series avoids numbness by sprinkling in those small human beats, but I'd still love to see a little more tonal variety in the March segments, not through goofy humor, but through different emotional colors, curiosity, tenderness, even irritation that isn't tied to existential dread. Life has texture even in war. The show is best when it remembers that. Now, there's something else I want to mention for newcomers. Don't expect this drama to hold your hand with mythology rules. It's not that kind of show. It throws you into a world where gods are jealous, seals exist, and power is inherited, and it trusts you to keep up. That can be thrilling if you like inference. If you prefer explicit lore dumps, you might feel slightly unanchored at times. Personally, I like the trust. I like when a drama assumes I have a brain and doesn't spell every implication out. The seal concept is simple enough to carry the weight. Kale is hidden for safety, and that safety has a cost. Everything else can unfold from that. And speaking of cost, the series keeps framing Kale's awakening as both miracle and disaster. The miracle is obvious: he saves Selene, he kills threats, he gives Sparta hope. The disaster is quieter: the world now knows he exists. Xerxes is furious. The border heats up. The god's attention is a looming shadow. Kale's life is no longer his. That's the tragedy baked into the premise. I want to return to Lyra one more time, because I think the show is setting her up as more than the mom who sealed him. She's the moral knot. Because if you judge her harshly, she made him suffer, you risk missing how brutal the world is. If you excuse everything, she had no choice, you risk minimizing Kale's pain. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. She made the best choice she could under fear, and it still hurt him. That's adult storytelling. That's the kind of moral messiness that makes me keep thinking about a show after the episode ends. And this is where I'll confess something else about my reaction. I found myself wishing, almost irrationally, that Kale could have one scene where someone from the palace just says the simplest, most human thing: "I'm sorry." Not as a dramatic climax. Not as an apology tour. Just a quiet acknowledgement that what happened to him was wrong. Because in real life, we rarely get that. Systems rarely apologize. People rarely confess cruelty when it was socially rewarded. So part of me is craving that catharsis. And part of me is scared the show will deny it, because denial might be the more honest choice. Either way, I'm invested enough that I care. Now, since you asked for an outro, I get why. You want the knee trap, that so should you watch it. But the problem is, Anak Terbuang isn't the kind of story that deserves a neat wrap halfway through its emotional transformation. This is a drama that lives in build-up and consequence. If I give you a tidy closing now, I'd be doing the show a disservice, because the real punch is in watching how Kale carries this burden forward, and how the world responds to him once it realizes he can't be stuffed back into a corner. So let's keep walking with the 300 for a minute. Because there's something almost ritualistic about how the show frames them as they near the pass. The soldiers become less chatty. The camera starts using longer lenses that compress the distance, making the cliffs feel closer, making the path feel tighter. Even the wind sounds different, sharper, like it's scraping the edges of the frame. The show is telling you, without saying it, you are entering a place where choices will be permanent. And Kale, at the center, feels like the only one who understands that permanence isn't just about life and death. It's about identity. Once he fights openly as what he is, there's no going back to being just Kale. Even if he survives, the world will never allow him to be ordinary. And maybe, this is the heartbreak, maybe he doesn't even know what he would do with ordinariness anymore. Here's a hook that's going to matter when the first lines meet. If Kale is the war god awakening, what exactly is awakening inside the people following him? Because power doesn't only change the person who has it. It changes everyone around them. It changes what they think is possible. It changes what they think they deserve. It changes what they think they can demand. And that's where revolutions start, not always political revolutions, but moral ones. The 300 might start believing in miracles. They might start believing in cruelty as necessary. They might start believing in sacrifice as destiny. Kale's power is going to shape their psychology, and the show has a chance to explore that in really compelling ways. And if the series is as smart as it's been, it won't just show us a glorious last stand. It'll show us the cost of belief. Because belief is not free. Belief makes you brave, yes. But belief can also make you reckless. It can make you dehumanize your enemies. It can make you treat your leader like a god instead of a person. And that's where things get dangerous for Kale. Not when people hate him, he's used to hate. When people worship him. When they stop seeing his limits. When they decide his pain is acceptable because it serves the cause. That's when the Anak Terbuang becomes Dewa Perang, and that transition is not purely triumphant. It's terrifying. Now, in terms of performances beyond Kale and Celine, the show benefits when it gives supporting characters distinct rhythms. Some soldiers speak fast to cover fear. Some speak slow like every word is weighed. Some avoid eye contact because guilt sits on them. Those details are what make the ensemble feel real. I want the series to keep investing in that, because if Thermopylae is going to matter, the 300 have to feel like people, not props. And I'll say this, the show has already shown it can do crowd emotion well. The palace panic after Aristos falls, the desperate atmosphere when Urag and Zirian attack, those scenes are hard to stage without becoming noisy mush. Anak Terbuang keeps them readable. You feel the wave of fear move through a group, and that's not easy. That suggests a director who understands blocking and an editor who knows when to cut for clarity versus when to hold for emotion. I'm also a fan of how the show uses light as moral atmosphere. The palace is lit like judgment. The battlefield is lit like truth, harsh, revealing, unforgiving. And Kale's golden eyes are lit like intrusion, something supernatural forcing itself into the human palate. That's a cohesive visual philosophy. It makes the show feel authored. At this point, the drama has set up a very specific promise. Kale is going to stand at Thermopylae and face an overwhelming force. The legend of the 300 is baked into the premise. But the series' emotional promise is different. Kale is going to be tested not just as a fighter, but as a person trying to stay intact. And if you've been watching my reviews for a while, you know that's the kind of story I'm weak for. Not perfection. Not invincibility. Intactness. The struggle to not become the worst thing the world thinks you are. So no, I'm not ready to roll credits yet. Not emotionally, and not because the show has earned more attention than a quick sign-off. There's still too much tension in the air, too many questions about gods, about Xerxes' next move, about how Sparta will treat Kale once the immediate emergency becomes a long-term reality, about whether Selene can keep being that grounding presence when the world starts turning her into a pawn, and about whether Kale can lead 300 men into a narrow pass without losing the one thing he's been trying to reclaim since childhood, the right to be seen as a human being first, and only then as whatever the world insists on carving out of him.